You're asking, why is it around? Is it answering some new need? Yes, I think it is. The new need that I think horror is answering is to give us, or to help restore to us, a proper vocabulary for evil.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And for those of you who have been listening for years, you know that here just before Halloween is the episode of the year in which we let Cameron off his leash. The man with if you're watching this on video, you see the crazy clown in the corner in the background there. So brace yourself. A man with a clown and a penchant for horror coming up on Halloween. What will it be this year? I now sit back, drink my tea, and listen.
Well, I thought one interesting way to center the conversation would be violence this year. So we've talked about Halloween as a holiday in the past before, and I thought this time it would be. I've done a lot of thinking about scary movies, and have been writing a book on the subject for way too long. And I am hopeful. I can say more about that in a bit. I'm hopeful that book will actually see the light of print here in the next year or so. But so I wanted to talk about movies. So horror films are as popular today as they have ever been, probably more so actually right now. Horror is just dominating the box office in a number of different ways. So first of all, there is the fact that horror films actually are doing original stories in ways that a lot of other films aren't right now. Hollywood is playing it safe and releasing sequel after sequel.
But you have Saw 1, yes. 2, 3. I mean, there is some repetition in the genre,
well, of
right?
Course. No, so I was about to say that. Yeah, so absolutely. So it's not like horror films are without their sequels. Absolutely. You have, you could just rattle off any number of franchises. Scream 6 just came out, the Halloween movies, the Saw movies, and so on. But you do have a number of horror films that are coming out with original storylines. Some of the recent ones, Longlegs would be one, Hereditary, The Witch, Nosferatu's coming out Christmas. I know that's not an original story in the sense that some of those other ones are, but lots of stories that from a script standpoint in Hollywood are a risk because they're genuinely new ideas. Smile would be another one, although Smile 2 is in theaters right now. But that's, again, it's new. Horror tends to be very inventive and forward-thinking, which is one of the reasons it can be an interesting genre. So you have that, but also in terms of box office numbers as well, which I'm going to admit is not something I pay a whole lot of attention to. I'm not usually that interested in Rotten Tomatoes scores and all of that. I like what I like. I know what I like, and I don't need, a Rotten Tomatoes score to figure that out for me. But what's been interesting here is that you have a major prestige production like the Joker sequel from Todd Phillips, A-list director, all A-list actors, Joaquin Phoenix, Lady Gaga, and it is really a box office flop. Now, I mean, it's a whole separate story. I thought the first Joker was not. I didn't think it was very good. I know a lot of people. It was compelling in some ways. It wasn't. I'll just leave it at that. I didn't like it, so I didn't expect to like this one either. But what I absolutely did not expect was for a film like Terrifier 3, which is an extremely low budget film. I did not expect Terrifier to outperform Joker 2, a DC Comics movie with an A-list director, A-list actors. That's interesting. It's also a notoriously viciously violent film as well. And I don't know if you knew this, Nathan. Terrifier 3 is interesting from a ratings standpoint as well, because it is, I think, it might be the highest grossing unrated film to hit theaters. If it were rated, it would absolutely be an NC-17. It wouldn't qualify for an R rating. And usually that is box office suicide for a film. In the 70s, there was a brief span where you had some films. Back then, it wasn't an NC-17. Back in the 70s, it was the X rating. There was. I'm not going to name these films. There was an example of a film in particular that was a famous NC that was an X-rated film that did really well. That's the only time that's happened in the recent past. ever since then, it's been box office suicide to have a rating like that or unrated until Terrifier 3. So that's interesting. And so I thought we could use this as an occasion to talk about on-screen violence, not violence in general. I want to limit our discussion because Nathan, you have so many thoughts on violence, but let's limit it. If you can do this, if you could, for me, let's limit it to on-screen depictions of violence and to discuss their role in the public imagination and the reputation that horror films have. And this is a disqualifier for many people, by the way. And I understand that. And I'm sympathetic to that, by the way. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that in particular, if that sounds agreeable to you, my fearless host.
Okay, three things actually. One is, so Cameron will also say, fully recognizing these movies are not for everybody or most people or of interest to most people and everybody. So we recognize we're going down a niche category here. If you want to look at the Cameron's arguments for the value of horror as a spiritual awakening, see some previous episodes on it. Two questions for you, Cameron. Why is it that a Terrifier 3 can outgross a Hollywood A-list? Is it because Hollywood's getting worse, or everybody else is able to do more on a smaller budget? Or B, and this fits into the second question I have, so why is violence increasingly a better seller? I'm not sure that that's the right way to ask that question. So why is it?
No, that's a good question.
I guess I have I have logistical whys and then like cultural why questions.
Sure.
Simultaneously about violence.
Yes. Okay. Well, we need to categorize different kinds of on-screen violence in a second here, and that's not going to be a pure academic exercise. That's actually going to be practically helpful as we consider this. So let's think about, well, for one, you asked why do I think Terrifier 3 is doing better? Well, first of all, it's been very well marketed. That's not the only reason, but they have played up the hype of how people have responded to the movie. So when Terrifier 2 was released, there were reports of people throwing up in the theater, people fainting, that sort of thing. Now, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I tend to be skeptical. That comes across to me as a marketing gimmick, but it's a successful one. And by the way, the horror genre has a history of that kind of sensationalism. It matches, by the way, the same kind of tactics that you would see at a carnival, especially at a sideshow, where you'd have a barker standing outside of a tent talking about, what the otherworldly sights that they're going to experience. So William Castle, who was a producer in the past, when he released a film called The Tingler, starring Vincent Price, one of the gimmicks that he had, so in The Tingler, there's this creature that burrows into the spine of its victims, and that's how it kills them. So what William Castle did was he had actual, these things, these machines, little devices installed into various theater seats that would buzz whenever and vibrate when the Tingler would show up on screen. And so people in the theaters would freak out and panic and scream. And
so it's like a 4D kind of add-on special effect.
Correct. Absolutely. And this was the Tingler came out in the 1960s, I think. But these kind of marketing strategies have been around for a long time. Certain other movies, they have passed out barf bags. It's kind of a gimmick. They've done that with the Terrifier movies now too. So it's known. So that reputation became known. The first one, when the first one came out, and I cannot recommend these movies at all, by the way. And this is, by the way, why people are going to see them too. So what I've just said sounds like reverse psychology. If I tell young people, no, this movie crosses the line, don't go see it. Guess what they're going to want to do, But I mean, it's hard to overstate just how in bad taste many of these murders are on screen. I mean, it really is. It's a despicably vile film. And that's kind of what it's built its reputation on. So you have that word of mouth. You have a truly terrifying villain. I mean, in this case, it's Art the Clown. Art the Clown is about as frightening a clown as you're ever going to come across. And even more so when you see Art the Clown in action. So the movie is, genuinely, vile, genuinely frightening in some ways. In other ways, it's not really that scary. It's more gross out. But I think those are some of the reasons it's done well. But if I may, I want to introduce a few just distinctions when it comes to on-screen violence, and then see whether you buy them, Nathan. First of all,
okay.
But yeah, so it helps to give a little bit of a background on horror films and how certain horror films work. So, Nathan, here's something else that's worth stating out loud for our Thinking Out Loud followers. I think it's safe to say that Nathan has probably never watched a single horror film. Have you ever watched anything that would qualify as horror, Nathan?
Yeah. I don't think it. Yeah, I don't think I have. No.
No, I didn't think so. So, Terrifier is part of a subgenre of horror known as a slasher. And there are so many debates about this, but arguably the slasher begins with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And then there are other films that anticipate it. Then there's Black Christmas, an underappreciated classic, which is a genuinely scary movie directed by Bob Clark. Fun fact, Bob Clark is the same guy who directed A Christmas Story with the Red Ryder BB gun movie. Yeah, he also he's directed a number of interesting
irony for you.
Yeah, exactly. So Black Christmas was a proto slasher, but then the first real full blown slasher is probably John Carpenter's Halloween, which is another horror classic. Interestingly enough, Halloween has very little direct on screen explicit violence. If you see it, you'll be surprised. It really does. It's a much more clever film, and it's much more about suspense than it is about bloodshed. That is not something that changed with later slasher films. But then the arrival of the real gory slasher begins probably with Friday the 13th. The original came out in 1980, and Friday the 13th kind of. And then there was a whole heyday there were so many slashers that came around, and all of them were inferior to Halloween. They became much more about actual just bloodshed, and they got very formulaic. But one thing that developed out of this, which is pertinent to the conversation, is that they grew increasingly focused on practical effects, specifically the effects surrounding gore and the deaths of characters. And that really, so to the point where one of the people involved in those, Tom Savini, he actually has a cameo in Terrifier 3. Tom Savini became a household name, even though he was just a background special effects guy. And so he became instrumental in the staging of these very elaborate deaths, which became a huge part of the draw of slashers. So increasingly, these scenes are even called kills. And I know that sounds like very, kind of dark language right there, but they're also, people watch them and grew increasingly interested in their technical execution. No pun intended. So that's one form of on-screen violence. I would argue, now I'm not justifying it, there's a heavy emphasis on the technical aspects of those kills, and there's a lot of people watch them almost with engineers' eyes, and it became very much about how those were staged. There's that. Then there are forms of on-screen violence that are more realistic. So think about a movie like Saving Private Ryan. In particular, think about the storming of the beach in Normandy. That's now a very famous scene, and it is celebrated for its the stark realism that you have of those soldiers who are just getting mowed down and all that. So let me just pause there, Nathan, and say, can you recognize, from your outsider's perspective, a meaningful distinction between, now I'm not talking in terms of ethics yet, but a meaningful distinction between an elaborately staged murder in a slasher movie and the opening sequence of, say, Saving Private Ryan? Which have you seen that movie?
I haven't, but okay. What's curious, what's interesting to me here, though, Cameron, is that nobody has or shouldn't have, I hope not, has a reference point for whether what they're seeing is realistic or not. So you can show me a picture of a flower, let's say a snapdragon, and I can say, yeah, that picture of a snapdragon
Mhm.
looks exactly like what a snapdragon looks like because I've seen a lot of snapdragons. I've never seen a human dissected. Or
Mhm.
I've never seen somebody shot between the eyes by a sniper. So I don't have a
Mhm.
so there's that part. I don't have a frame of reference for it. And then I have two why questions. Um in Saving Private Ryan, you would have a sense of like this is depicting a war and this is the heinousness of war.
Mhm.
In
Mhm.
a maybe a classic action movie, a James Bond type thing, John Wick, something like
Mhm.
that. There's violence that's done as revenge. So this guy kills this guy's
Mhm.
girlfriend or dog, and then this
Yep.
guy, can unleash
Dog.
whatever violence.
Yeah.
Um, what
Mhm.
what what's the why in a slasher? What purpose is it do? Is it just for queasiness sake? Is that the goal? And if
Mhm.
so, then why do people want to pay to go watch that? And where's the point in which we can
Mhm.
say there's something either like okay, um, for example, in the last week,
Mhm.
I'm trying to tally something up here. Yeah, in the last week, I've killed a deer, 40 chickens, and 7 ducks. I've seen more actual blood and death this week, Cameron,
Yeah.
than you will in your
Sure.
life. Um,
Yep.
and washed more blood off of stuff than you. Yeah. So to me, like the
Mhm.
blood and the guts and the gore is not that's a part of life. Um,
Uh-huh. Yep.
but not when it's a human. So it's like there's something that seems slightly like a massive disconnect to me of like, oh, people enjoy watching other people pressure wash rugs and find that therapeutic to watch somebody clean their rug. What is it about like why what yeah, I from an outside looking in, my wheels are spinning on the why here of why does this make money or
Mhm.
people intentionally want to see it?
Yeah.
Help me connect the dots there.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, that's a big question, but I think I actually can give you, I've been thinking about it for a long, long time because since I was, my first concrete memory of this was I was 4 years old. As at least 4 years old, I've been interested in horror and scary stuff. So, but I don't like every horror movie or story any more than somebody who likes action films likes every action film. So it's worth pointing that out too. So, what's the draw here? Well, there are different reasons people are drawn to this stuff. Some people are just thrill seekers, and so there's an element of frisson and danger and excitement. Particularly, I think a lot of young people are in this category. So there are plenty of teenagers or younger. A lot of kids, by the way, with Terrifier 3. They've noted a ton of younger people are buying tickets for other movies and sneaking into this one. So I think the chances of these kids, when they're grown up, they're 35 and married with kids, still watching movies like Terrifier are pretty low. I think most of them will outgrow that. Okay, so there's one category of people who are just there's the thrill of it. It's kind of fun. Then there are others who are drawn to it in a different way, find it more interesting. I've mentioned some people who are interested in the special effect of the deaths, and in a film like Terrifier 3, those deaths are very carefully staged, and they're extremely gory and they're very elaborate, and it took a whole lot of skill to pull them off. And again, I'm not saying that's a noble thing by any means, but there are very elaborate special effects. I can point back to Terrifier harkens back to another very famous DIY horror film that became an outrageous success, even though it had absolutely no budget. And these guys made it by the skin of their teeth. And that movie was The Evil Dead. And Evil Dead came out in, I can't remember the precise, I'll have to look it up, but I think it was the late 70s, maybe early 80s when Evil Dead came out. And that was directed by Sam Raimi, who then went on. I mean, he's since directed he's the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. So he's gone on to become a major director. But that was all about, now, Evil Dead is actually an NC-17 movie because of the explicit gore. Now, the gore in it is very cartoonish looking to me, but I mean, it is. It's a very gory film, but all of it part of the joy of Evil Dead is that if you read about the making of it, was how incredibly limited they were on resources. I mean, many of the scenes were shot in a garage that was supposed to be a basement, sort of a cellar in a cabin. And they were using everything from dog food to as stand-ins for gore. I mean, they were doing all sorts of DIY stuff in the back. But again, it was all about the execution of how they actually made this happen and brought it to screen, and that was a big draw. But for others, and here's my pretentious sounding answer, but I think it's the right one, and this is what I argue for in my book with my friend and former professor Philip Talon. I think the other pole of this stuff is what I'm going to call the sublime. And I want to use that in the sense that Edmund Burke uses it in his tract On the Sublime. But basically, it's a sense of awesomeness and terror, often practical terror. You can't enjoy it or experience it properly if you're in the midst of it. So it's the difference between looking at the immensity of a mountain and actually fighting for your life when you're hanging on for dear life from some precipice on the mountain, or looking at a grizzly bear from a distance versus actually being hunted by that bear. If you're being hunted by the bear, there's no room for any kind of feeling of admiration or pleasure at all. It's just simply pure terror and instinct, and you're trying your best to survive. Self-preservation takes over entirely. If you can court it from a distance, though, if you can look at the bear from a distance, if you can enjoy the immensity and the scale of a mountain from a distance, or if you can climb onto a roller coaster and sort of touch the hem of those awesome experiences that could take your life, then there's a feeling, there's a tremendous wonder that comes with it. Now that will sound maybe somewhat strange, but most people have some sort of analog in their heads for that. Most people have some way they enjoy that. Horror films, when people really love horror as a genre and they like to be scared, that's part of it, I think. I'll pause there so you can tear me apart for having said that.
oh, that'll come tear you apart. It seems to be the fitting,
we're not buying that
phrase here. Yeah. So why... So answer the same question from a different direction. So why do I have zero desire for that in my life? Knowing what you know about me.
Well, not everybody does. I think everybody has an appreciation of the sublime.
I've chased real bears in the woods, but in my running shoes. But I know about adrenaline and excitement, but
everybody
dismembering a human just doesn't quite do it for me.
Well, okay, first of all, let me stop you there. Not all horror involves the dismemberment of humans. So we're talking about Terrifier 3 there for a second, which the slasher subgenre is one subgenre. Horror is not limited to that. And I would argue the best horror films are subtle and do not rely on explicit gore to do the work for them. Now, this is debatable. A lot of people will say a horror film doesn't have to scare you.
Yeah, but I'm saying I don't think the blood and the guts and the gore is what makes something scary.
No, not at all.
To me, a slasher doesn't make sense in that category. Yeah.
No, and the greatest quote slashers, they weren't known as slashers when they came out. That subgenre hadn't been coined yet. It's probably a journalist. It's always journalists who name things, trends. But the originals, so something like Halloween. And then the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original 1972 film, which is, I think, 1974. It's just had its anniversary. So those films are, first of all, from any standpoint, a technical standpoint, they're brilliant films. They truly are frightening. And you wouldn't believe it certainly by the title of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, minimal on-screen violence in both of them. Actually, they're much more psychologically menacing. They're not overtly gory. They're very clever films, and they have, in the case of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you never forget the humanity of the victims or the villains. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually a very profound film, and I'm not the only one by a long shot to say that. Film scholars have been saying that for a long time. A number of people have said that. It is, yes, it starts off as a kind of an exploitation film, but is actually it's a lot more than that. So I'm with you. The gore thing, it's a gimmick. It's not what makes a film scary. But if a film is going to, so your original question though was, why am I not drawn to that? Well, I think the draw to the sublime is a universal thing, but it takes different forms, and certainly not everybody's drawn to horror films. Different people. I would say, Nathan, you're a very adventurous person, and you're drawn to actual adventures and real challenges. I mean, those are iterations of that same impulse. So it need not be. It's not limited to horror by any means.
Is it a real thing in and of itself, or is it a substitute for something else somewhere else in modern life? Like, is there
no? It's a real thing. Like, I think.
I'm trying to go back through. Like, let's scroll this back 500 years, where most people had seen somebody dismembered or killed.
Oh, I see what you're asking. I think, yeah,
it is like were we producing like
yes.
So there are. So I guess if that's a category of sublime that I can't even comprehend, so I'm listening here and trying to learn, but I haven't come close to wrapping my head around it.
No,
I'm saying is that a modern instantiation of some deeper human impulse or drive that A, I'm either missing, or B, is more of a digital film or a modern film. Is there something unique about our time that makes this more interesting?
Yes. So I have an answer for that. Yeah, and I think I'm right on this, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because it's my answer. I haven't seen anybody else say this yet, but I think I do think I'm right on this. Horror is a latecomer as a genre. It's pretty new on the scene. And there are many debates about where it precisely starts, what precise book it begins with, but most people agree it's the shadow side of the Romantic movement, and it starts in England with some of the Gothic novels, which take place at decaying mansions that are filled with ghosts, and usually those ghosts are they're a powerful symbol or metaphor for the fact that the past is never past, and people's the sins of the past come back to haunt you. It's kind of, you think of Freud's Return of the Repressed. But the first real accomplished horror novel, there is agreement on this, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus.
Okay, I've read that.
So, yep. So here's what's really interesting. You're asking, why is it around? Is it answering some new need? Yes, I think it is. The new need that I think horror is answering is to give us, or to help restore to us, a proper vocabulary for evil. Because what's happening during the Romantic moment, you have the Romantic movement is reacting against the depredations of, among other things, the Industrial Revolution, and also an increasing reductionism that's coming about as a result of the success in the hard sciences. There are many wonderful breakthroughs; they're tremendous, but you have to remember also, this is when Charles Darwin and others are coming along who are increasingly giving us a very disillusioned picture of the universe in which we live. And so the Romantics are talking about retreating from those nasty cities with their smog and their coal back into natural settings, back into, think of Tintern Abbey and all that Wordsworth and Coleridge have to say about that. But you also have the loss of the moral significance of human action. So there was a time in history when people didn't need any kind of argument for the existence of evil. I mean, it was taken for granted that, yes, evil is real, and not only evil in the sense of people, doing things that are, put us at a social and societal disadvantage, but evil in the sense of no, there's something deeply wrong with human beings. There's a moral rot there. You move to a time where increasingly, no, that's not the case, and we're finally figuring out how everything works, and we can rule God out as an unnecessary hypothesis. But when you do that, you lose the moral significance behind so much of what's happening. And then a genre like horror is all part of what it's all about, is restoring a proper vision of evil, real evil in the world. There is such a thing as evil, and we can't explain it away. We can't psychologize it away. It's not that Michael Myers wasn't hugged enough. So to take Halloween, one of the original slashers, Halloween begins with a murder, and it's shot from a point of view. It's a famous opening shot. It took a lot of time to stage it. It wasn't easy to pull off. Halloween was also shot on a very, very low budget. And it's this murder. You're in the killer's head. It's from the killer's perspective, traipses up the stairs and murders a girl in her room, but goes down the stairs. Police show up, parents show up. And then when a mask is pulled off and the murderer is revealed, it's a little boy. And that little boy is Michael Myers, and he'll grow up to be this killer. There's no explanation offered for why he would do what he did. There's no careful. Now, modern sequels of the movie tried to supply clear reasons and psychology and all of that, but in the original, it's a mystery why he does that. He's evil. He's simply evil. So horror films and horror stories have helped to restore. I mean, remember, Frankenstein is all about hubris and overreaching and scientific pride and what happens when we try to play God. So, and then the other major horror story, I think the two great horror stories were Frankenstein and then The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde also famously involves a person who thinks that he can gain control of the fallenness in his nature. And of course, it goes catastrophically wrong. So I think horror does answer a modern need. It helps to give us a vocabulary for evil.
Do you think that's just purely subconscious, or is there an intentional element to that? Like, so you're kind of laying this out in theological categories and terms, but is
sure,
or is there just a sense like it just works, so we're going to keep making these? Like, so maybe answer the question coming in from this alley. You make a documentary to educate. You make a action movie to entertain. You make a horror movie to, like, as if somebody was making if you could put your mind in the producer to say, as a result of this film, I want people to be or to feel. You're going to argue that it's entertained.
Okay. Oh yeah. So do I think that there's an elaborate, behind the scenes intentional conspiracy on the part of, people who dabble in horror or make it to do that kind of thing, to sort of help give us a vocabulary for evil? No. I think it would be it's true of some of them, by the way. The guy who wrote The Exorcist, that was his explicit intention, William Peter Blatty. It wasn't the explicit intention of the director of the movie, by the way. That's William Friedkin. But no, for the most part, I think it would be truer to say that horror stories resonate with us because of this deep need. For many people, it's not clearly articulated. It's not even recognized. But horror films handle violence in a way that's different from a John Wick film. Usually, most of them, you feel the force of that violence in a different way. In a John Wick film, or in a mindless action film, the violence often is part of what keeps the plot moving along. In a horror film, you have more of a emphasis on the heinousness behind the act and how these things could be perpetrated by, in the case of more modern films, persons. Halloween was so terrifying to audiences when it came out, because Halloween came out at a time when the phrase serial killer was first being used in a serious sense. That's a relatively modern coinage, by the way. And so part of what made Halloween so frightening was this is not some supernatural villain or some quote monster. This is a person. And he's not, these murders are taking place in comfortable suburban settings, in
Okay,
people's,
hey,
in the safe places of their homes. And yeah.
So, but is there a correlation between our collective cultural fascination with horror and our own safety? In the sense that we do live at like one of the safest times ever, where your chances, I mean, like, so the things that you would see in a horror film, you have a very low chance of that happening. You and I, in the last month, we've known of an example of this, though, that it wasn't somebody brutally
Yeah.
murdered in their home. So I feel like I live with a very real graphic sense of the weight of evil, and I don't need to think of it as a fantasy category in order to be stimulated in those categories. Is there like a sense of like stable, secure suburbia that just needs a thrill? Is that?
No, I don't think so. I think no, the two major services today that horror films perform are a kind of a recognition of evil as something that is very real and present in human life. And yeah, I mean, you as a mature Christian probably don't need that, but I think many people casually do sort of just slide into this whole, well, yes, I mean, people do horrible things and home invasions happen and all of that, but that's largely due to ignorance. And if we can just fix some of these social issues, then that will go away. So that's a pretty naive anthropology. And that does need to be addressed. And that's for a lot of people. But the other big thing that horror films do is they help us to see that there's more to life than meets the eye. There are more things on heaven and on earth than are dreamed of in our philosophies. And a film that really, I think, that comes to mind still that did this really well was Paranormal Activity. And that came out, I think, in 2009, the found footage movie about, and made on absolutely no budget whatsoever, in which a couple are assailed by a demon. The woman is in particular is being haunted by this demon, and it grows increasingly fierce and enraged by the end of the film. And the movie is really terrifying. And part of what it did was it rattled jaded modern audiences who thought they didn't believe in that kind of stuff. But it turned out they were deeply frightened of it, even after the credits had rolled. It's the same thing The Exorcist did in the 1970s. So horror films can also restore a sense of enchantment. Now, do you need them to do that? No, absolutely not. In no way, shape, or form are horror films necessary at all. And so I'm not an apologist for horror films or anything like that, but I do think I can help folks a little bit in understanding their appeal in terms that aren't just purely negative. There are many people who are fans of horror. They're not crazy, they're not psychotic, they're not, and they're not masochistic or dark individuals. There's nothing wrong with them. Many of them, there are some real powerful motivating factors behind a draw to scary stories and scary movies. Not all of them, but so part of what I want to do is just open that up a little bit for those on the outside looking in, thinking, what on earth? And I think that's a normal question to ask, by the way. Horror as a genre raises the same question that tragedy does. And because the question of tragedy is just, why on earth would you put yourself through this? And that's a question that's not, you can give answers. It's not settled. I mean, since they've been wrestling with that from ancient Greece onwards, that was the big question that Aristotle, tried to give an answer to that. Why in his example was the Oedipus, Sophocles was kind of his supreme example of a great tragedy. So why would you put yourself through something so painful? Horror is in the same similar category. Why would you do this to yourself? How is this entertaining?
Well, I think you've made a good stab at showing us a little bit of the broader thinking behind that.
Stab,
I think
really?
Stab at it. Yeah. See what I did there? It's a sticky situation. The what earlier in the week, you're like, oh, it's time. We were joking. It's time to do the Halloween episode. So really, if you are new and listening in on this, you can go back and basically look at the end of October for the last, I don't know, several years, as Cameron and I have argued back and forth. You might be able to guess kind of the sides of the value that we see in a whole host of this. And Cameron, you jokingly said, I think basically, Nathan, you've won the Christian version of this. And, it's easy to say that in the sense of all of the New Testament references about, thinking about that which is lovely and pure, or not having filthiness or silly
actually,
talk, or coarse jest, all that. We don't throw that in here because I don't think it's so. There's plenty of Christian argumentation that could be happening there of like why I don't want to put this in my mind, and Cameron would agree to all of that. Mm-hmm. However, I'm not so sure, Cameron, that your analysis there. Well, don't sell yourself short here, because what I'm saying is you're also looking at something that is a multi-million dollar industry in our culture that is only increasing in its fascination. And so I think for the Christian world, or so maybe you have some deep convictions and sensibilities about this as you listen, as I do too. On the other hand, you can't act like it's not there, or that there shouldn't be Christians who are thinking about it and trying to make sense of it. So I think there's a both and value where somebody could say, okay, well, there's the one side of this. By and large, the type of feedback that we get when we do our Halloween episodes is not, is there value in horror? It's, is there even value in doing a podcast on it? And so I think what we're trying to do here is to guide in the direction of saying, hey, this is a significant part of the entertainment industry. And are there elements within it that say something profound about our culture and where we're at? And then how do we want to live in the light of that? So I'm happy to justify and have my feet under me in my own line of argumentation and my own engagement with the genre, at the same time appreciating Cameron's willingness to kind of stick his head down that rabbit hole and highlight for those of us who are just kind of sitting there with a blank stare of like, what's the big deal? Because most of the world is more fascinated. So if you're in the category of like, yeah, I don't get it, you're in the minority. I'll put it that way. And so Cameron's bringing us into a more majority perspective on maybe categories of you can appreciate or argue with his argumentation and different trains of thought there. But I think either way, you have to appreciate the work done there. So Cameron, that's kind of my caveat balance there in the end of I can see reasons why I don't want to engage with it or don't feel the need to, or maybe I can justify my lack of interest in it theologically. But I think if we're thinking and speaking culturally, then certainly your finger is much more closely on the pulse of our culture when it comes to this topic. So appreciate you dragging me along here with my blank stares and legitimate questions.
Sure. And dragging all of you along with us. Much more can be said on this topic, but I'm going to button my lips. I hope to say more about a possible book on this topic coming out soon for those interested. Especially our hope, me and Phil Talon's hope is to actually really for the morbidly curious, or those who just think, what on earth? Why would anybody, that the book would really be for you. So anyway, with that in mind, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.